Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming again. Hopefully, some of you return repeat customers to our Athletics Canada weekly webinar. This is the final webinar of the, I guess, the COVID series, if you will, where we've been going weekly. And we've got a very highbrow panel today, well, at least in Alex in my case, and Sean and Tim are well coiffed. But we're talking about social science approaches to distance running, and we'll get to what that means exactly, because there's some interesting things that we're going to touch on here today. I'm going to just go through a couple housekeeping items. Your mics have been muted, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Hopefully, you can hear us. If you have any questions, and ideally we'll have some time at the end for questions from you after you've heard and digested a bit what it is that we are talking about here. You can put that in the chat box, and we'll add it to our queue. Kyle Smith is behind the scenes managing that for us. Let's see what else. If you're having any technical problems, again, use the chat. Kyle will try to sort that out for you. We are recording the webinar, and it will be posted on the Athletics Canada website under the coaching education / e-learning page. We're scheduled for about 60 minutes, and we will try really hard to stick to that because we know you possibly scheduled other things, and especially one of the reasons our series is coming to an end is that practices are opening up again, and coaches have coaching to do hopefully now. So yes, we're going to try to stick to that. Since this is the last one, I wanted to say, thanks. We've had over 1,000 live views of our various webinars, including today, which is awesome, and about half that number of people who've signed up to rewatch or watch the recorded version. So that's great. So thank you. We do plan to return with more like maybe a monthly series starting in mid-July. We're going to have a webinar focused on women in our sport. And then from there, like I said, probably once a month. But the response has been good, so thank you for that. It's good feedback. We know that this is a thing that people want, so that's great. If you have ideas for future webinars, you can throw them in the chat, or you just email Kyle directly, coaching@athletics.ca, and he will sort through all of your great ideas. So I'm going to introduce the panelists real quick, and then I'm going to kind of start talking about this topic. So first we have Tim Konoval, who's a lecturer in sport coaching at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, by Zoom only at this point, I guess. Hasn't been able to get there yet, so he's in Alberta right now. He has degrees in sports and exercise science, management, coaching, and social science disciplines. Diverse educational and real-world experience. Our former high-performance middle distance runner and a coach, and that's allowed him to think differently and help others challenge the status quo in coaching, sport, and physical activity contexts. And I just thought it was interesting. 1500 meter PB 341. Next, we have someone who probably is well known to you, Alex Hutchinson. It's a big get for us because we know he does a lot of media and stuff. So it's cool that he would come and be on with us. He's a science journalist who writes about endurance sport for Outside, the Globe and Mail, and Canadian Running Magazine. His most recent book was the New York Times bestseller, Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. And he is also a former middle distance runner and lives in Toronto. And his 1500 meter PB is 342. We also have Sean Baynton. So Sean Baynton is, sorry, I have to look to a different document to get the info on Sean because we got him at the last minute. Sean is essentially the subject of Tim's papers. So that's why we've got him on here. He's got very direct experience with what we're going to talk about. But his credentials are he's a chartered professional coach, master's in education, NCCP level 4-5, and IAAF level 5 certified coach in endurance events. He's a head coach of the Golden Bears and Pandas cross country teams at the University of Alberta. and is the lead coach for endurance program with the Golden Bears and Pandas track and field program, and is a sessional lecturer at the University of Alberta's Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation. It's a master's diploma in high performance coaching from NCIBC, master's in coaching from UVic, and has been named to multiple Athletics Canada national teams as a head coach and event group coach, including FISU World University and IWF World Youth. I don't know, I mean, I think I've introduced myself before. Oh, his 1500 meter PB is 4 flat. I'm John Lofranco, coach and educator. I'm the manager of coach education for Athletics Canada. And I also coach endurance runners as well. I teach in the English department at Concordia University, where I also coach the university team, and I also have law degrees, and my 1500 PB is 409. So that you can rank our credibility based on our 1500 times, I think. I wanted to start this out, and I think what I'm going to lay out is kind of the conventional view that we think of when we think of coaching and training for distance running and training for endurance, and that is I'll call it the energy system paradigm. And I think most of us, and I'm assuming in the audience, take this for granted a little bit without thinking about it, that you need to do certain things to make your body change physiologically, and you need to develop different energy systems in order to be able to perform at distance running. And I think, that's, yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can get away from that. And what we're going to talk about today is more different approaches, so different ways of thinking about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the energy system stuff is useless, but I think, I guess the reason that I started to think differently is that when I see a lot of the prescriptions for workouts based on energy systems, and they're very numeric based, and runners love numbers, thinking about, okay, well, you have to do a workout at a certain percentage of VO2 max or a certain percentage of your heart rate, and I just feel like, again, with I don't have the science creds necessarily, and I'm only a 409 1500 runner, but it just didn't sit right. Like, how do you know for sure that when you're doing a 472 that's actually 87% of your VO2 max, and on that particular day for a particular athlete? Like, I think you'd have to do all kinds of testing in the moment right there after every interval to really know exactly what those things are. So to me, I started to think, well, like, then why does it even matter, right? Like, why would I care, what the exact split is or anything like that if it's not related to, if I can't really relate it to the physiological event? I kind of moved towards thinking more about race effort. So just try to run it at your 5K pace, because that's something that you can get a little closer to and kind of know. But and that's just, I guess, the beginning of where I started to think about this. And then I read Alex's article and my mind was blown. And so I'll let kind of Tim go next and talk about what it is that he wrote about, and how that takes my sort of initial, maybe surface level questioning to a whole other level.
All right, great, thanks, John. I'll share my screen here. There's the baby pointing at you. Okay. All right, so thanks, John. Thanks, Alex and Shauna, for being here. And thanks for having me on, and thanks for everybody that's listening. This is awesome. Finally a chance, after doing my dissertation in isolation for so many years, I get to do a little bit of knowledge translation here, and to the audience that I think can really be impacted by this, coaches. So thanks everybody for joining me and us. So first of all, as John said, fundamental to what endurance coaches do is planning. So here's a few visuals I'm sure that a lot of you can relate to. You have your periodized plan, so you have your macro, meso, micro cycles. You have the workouts that fit into this meticulously controlled plan. Some of the classic distance runner workouts, you got your 400 meters, your 200 meters, your threshold runs, tempo runs. And of course, mile repeats. Everybody knows about mile repeats or kilometer repeats, depending on where you are. So this is kind of the traditional, some of the ways of planning distance running training. And when you really break this down, especially when you get down to the workouts themselves, a lot of this is based, as John had just spoke about, based on kind of a foundation of physiological knowledge. So really based on the science and the discipline of physiology. So, to my next. So also, when you break it down even further, those workouts, your 8x400, your different interval workouts, the details that make up these workouts, the organization of these workouts are space, so where the workouts are done, typically on a track, or they might be done off-road as well, in a field, which usually you know the distance, it might be a kilometer, it might be a mile. And then we have time, another important detail to the organization of distance running workouts. Of course, the stopwatch is, I say, the distance running coach's best friend. You always see the stereotypical endurance coach with stopwatch, timing every interval, making sure they're getting the right amount of rest. And then we also have the progression of movement, which again falls in line with that periodized plan and making sure you're putting together all the parts of the perfect distance running plan to create all towards this penultimate performance. So we're looking for a nice linear progression all the way through. So of course, planning in this way, using this physiological knowledge, has provided some amazing performances. So clearly such planning in this way has great utility. And but what we don't know, and as John said, he started to question planning just with that foundation of physiological knowledge, is what might happen if an alternative knowledge or discipline is used to plan athletes training. So and also in recent years, endurance-oriented researchers have questioned the dominance of basing workouts solely on physiology. One of the big critiques is, as you can see here, this popular metaphor is the body isn't a machine, so it doesn't always operate. With whatever you input, we always don't get the same output. As John noticed, you can have this really nice, perfectly planned training plan. It can look great on paper, but when, I'm sure everybody can relate to this, when you get to the actual performance, a number of different factors can come into play. Athlete, the psychology, the emotional response, of course, the environment, lifestyle, so many different things come into play. So in addition to these critiques, researchers have also noted a number of unintended consequences in terms of athlete health and performance from participating in strictly controlled and organized and structured training plans. So some of these consequences, of course, are burnout, injuries. I'm sure, injuries are very prevalent in our sport. I'm sure a number of you have experienced it. And overtraining, and of course, the more extreme end, we have eating disorders, and then we have the dreaded underperformance. And a lot of times these underperformance can be something that happens unintentionally, and it keeps happening, and it's really hard to explain why that might be. So in addition to the unintended consequences, here are some, I hope a lot of you can relate to this, some classic distance runner problems. So think about the athlete that gives up in races when they hear splits that are slower than the pace that they were aiming to run. Or what about the athletes where there's certain benchmark workout that they run a few seconds slower than maybe they did a month prior, and then they want to scratch from the race coming up because they don't think they're going to be able to fall in line. And what about the runner that you know is super talented and should be beating all their teammates in a particular group, but is complacent in their ranking, being, say, the third or fourth athlete on the team? And it's really hard in races to disrupt that ranking, the pecking order that can happen within a group. So it's hard to move ahead and pass their teammates in actual races. Or what about the classic distance runner who's really good at workouts? And I know you're all nodding your heads right now, 8x400 meter heroes, but then when they get to a race, they're not able to race in the same way they work out, and they struggle and look disengaged with the performance. So they're really good at workouts, but not so much races. So So then what else could we do, and how could we challenge this traditional way of planning that I just kind of outlined? We have these unintended consequences and these problems that keep happening in distance running. So how can we plan differently, maybe use a different knowledge to help mitigate the unintended consequences and the performance-related problems that I just outlined there? So my dissertation is social science knowledge to explore what might happen if we challenge the kind of traditional way of planning distance running practices. Specifically, I use the work, and for those who have read my article or Alex's article, the work of Michel Foucault, famous French philosopher, to to understand what new practices might look like. So what do I mean? To break it down, what knowledge did I use from Foucault? Which one concepts did I use? So Foucault primarily wrote about the prison system and how certain techniques, or what he called technologies of discipline, were used to maintain control of the prisoners and keep them in a state of what Foucault called docility. So docility is a key concept for Foucault, and what it means is prisoners were to be unengaged, kind of unlearning, easily taught, really easy to manipulate and control. So docility, this was the end goal for the prison guards who were really looking to rehabilitate prisoners to be able to become productive members of society in a capitalist society and work in, say, the factory. So they wanted to kind of rehabilitate prisoners, and so a state of docility was ideal for that. So when people become docile or cogs in a system, their capacity to become active, engaged subjects is limited. So as the last point there, as you can imagine, docility can undermine the goal of any sort of performance training, where really when we're looking at athlete development, we want to develop athletes who are prepared to make countless decisions, untold decisions in races, and adapt to the chaos of competition in races where anything can and will happen. Of course, we all know this. So makes a lot of sense. So as I've talked about docility, that was a key concept for Foucault. The technologies of discipline, these three technologies were another, or techniques of discipline were other concepts for Foucault was really prevalent. And these three techniques are used to help mold prisoners to experience that state of docility. So these are actually the details. And as you can see, I have the control of activity is one of them. So time, space, and then the organization of genesis, or movement, or the progression of movement. So you can see from my pictures on the right, these three technologies of discipline map very well, if you think back to my second slide, to the way distance running coaches traditionally plan their practices. So using time, space, and the organization of movement to create these workouts. So then what can we do to prevent docility in distance running? So really my dissertation looked at what might happen if we disrupted some of these disciplinary techniques, time, space, and movement, in practices, used an alternative knowledge through using Foucault's knowledge to disrupt and see how practices might be different and what sort of outcomes we might be able to get from changing practice, what sort of athlete outcomes. And this is not to create, really it's to disrupt docility and to counter the effects of docility, which I just said before is not a very good performance state for athletes to be in. So now, how did I change practice? Or how did me and the coach that I was working with for my dissertation, how did we develop and implement these practices, and what did they look like? So some new practice examples, and I know coaches love seeing these new practices because they really want to know fundamentally, how are these different? How is this new knowledge creating a new practice? So 8 times 400 meters, so that's a traditional distance running practice, middle distance, whatever you want to say. So what can we do different? Well, no timing. So throw down your watch. The coach also doesn't use a watch. We don't know the time. So that's a way we can disrupt the constraints that athletes can then feel through constantly being timed, even though of course they're going to be timed in a race, but it doesn't mean they need to be timed in every single practice. Also, we can disrupt the effects of space through changing the distance. So why does it always have to be 200 meter, 400 meter, 800 meter? We run these nicely rounded numbers because we know that there's a certain physiological response or stress response that comes with doing those. But why can't we do 433? So we're disrupting really space and time. So they're not able to know the times. There's no benchmark kind of performance indicator for doing 433. So it can create kind of a new experience for the athletes to understand something new about their bodies and their capabilities. And also we can change the set number. You can also do the 400 meter off track in a different space. So Foucault wrote about how spaces can sometimes create disciplinary monotony. And I know we all can understand this from doing circles round and round on the track. So what if we used a bit of a different space? I know a lot of you guys have probably done this before and kind of flirted with these ideas without knowing who Foucault was. And then there's 400 meter to exhaustion. So where you don't have a set number. So you're disrupting some of that progression of movement by saying, by not giving a certain number of 400 meters. So instead, you're just instructing athletes to go to exhaustion. So run as many 400 meters as you can to achieve that state of exhaustion. Sometimes athletes can do this on their own or in a group. Sometimes with group dynamics, you can get caught up in the group and then you have certain rankings and athletes might all just stop at the same time. So, okay, and then for workout two, so 20-minute recovery tempo. How can we do this different? Well, we can give athletes choice to split up that 20-minute tempo in any way they want to be able to recover. So it can look a number of different ways. Some athletes might do, as I have examples there, 430 seconds. Some athletes might do two times 10 minutes or 10 times 2 minutes or 20 times 1 minute. So lots of different ways, but you're giving the athletes some autonomy, some choice over or how they recover and how they feel that their bodies need, what their bodies need to do to recover. So oftentimes the coach is predetermining this through those traditional endurance or distance running workouts that I explained earlier. So this kind of puts athletes in the driver's seat in a way to be able to make some decisions over what they need. You can also run that 20-minute recovery tempo backwards. It's pretty amazing when you've always run a certain route the same way. When you just turn around and go the other way, it's a very different view, and it can create a whole new experience for the athlete. And then you have 5 times 1 kilometer, so you can stagger the order that athletes are actually leaving in. So a lot of times there can be certain rankings within a group of athletes. And so by having, say, the athlete that's always in the back of the pack go to the front of the pack, it can be a very different experience, and maybe they can learn something new about themselves through being in the lead, because since they're always just trying to hang on the back of the pack. Another example is to do mystery surges. So maybe within 5 kilometers, you have 5 athletes, and each of the athletes is given a number from 1 to 5. And these are just examples. They're very easy to come up with. But then whatever number you have, that's when you put in a surge. So if you're the second one to go, you know, after one person has already gone, you do a surge, and it's for an undetermined length of time. So you determine how long that surge is, and then the next athlete that would go determines how long the rest is, and then they also determine how long their interval length is. So a little bit complicated, but hopefully you get the idea. And really, I know it sounds like, oh wow, these workouts are really fun, especially you get to roll the dice and that determines the length of the intervals. But when you break it down, all of these different types of workouts and practice examples, they're all underpinned by disrupting some of those technologies of discipline that I spoke about earlier, that space, time, and movement in some way to give us, to hopefully open up, for one, to make practices less disciplinary, and to make athletes less docile so that they can hopefully experience something new. And they're not always, you can see there's a lot of uncertainty with these practices. Oh, you don't know, you might not know training times. And so you might get some very different feedback from athletes, and there might be some new questioning. And obviously athletes will be able to make decisions as well that can lead to some pretty interesting things. So got one more slide, okay. So I just want to say, so with this new knowledge, It's informed by different perspectives. So it's just one perspective. So what I'm not saying is that physiology is all bad and we should use this social science knowledge to kind of replace it. But how can this knowledge be used and embedded within those traditional practices? And how can it be used sometimes, not every day, every practice, but how can sometimes it be used to have athletes experience something a little bit different? And you'll also know that typically with the interventions you'll see with distance runners, there's a lot of psychology where they'll come in and work on athletes, whether it be through motivation, using performance, using different performance skills, imagery, and these things. But they're all typically, those interventions are based on changing something with the athlete to then change performance. But I really want to outline here that these changes, this different sort of perspective is meant to change sort of coaching practices. So change the practice themselves to create new learning that by extension will hopefully open up some new performances for the athlete. And then going back, as we'll hear from Sean, who will talk about some of these changes and how he did that, it also can change your overall coaching philosophy when you don't have all these numbers and feedback and things to judge and examine your athletes based on. So I think that's all I have for that. And
cool. The baby. Show us the baby again.
Okay. Oh yes, there's the baby. Sorry guys, I got it.
So we're gonna.
There we go. Okay.
There you go. So we're gonna let Alex kind of have a go, because Alex wrote the article for Outside Magazine based on this stuff, and you know, he's known in the community for taking, you know, science, sports science, and distilling it down into ways that people can understand. So Alex, when you saw these articles, what did you make of it?
Yeah, so I'll try and be fairly concise, because hearing from Tim was awesome, and I think hearing Sean's sort of in the trenches perspective is going to be really, really helpful. But yeah, John, to your point, I first saw some of these papers 7 or 8 years ago about a Foucauldian approach to coaching, and I got them from Jim Dennison, who's one of Tim's, I guess, PhD supervisors. And I respect him, and I know him. He's a guy who wrote a biography of Haile Gebrselassie, and he's done, you know, he's a guy who knows what he's talking about. But I looked at it, and I got through, you know, I read the abstract, read some paragraphs. I just couldn't follow what was going on. Like it was hard slogging, and so I kind of left it thinking this might be an interesting idea. I'd like to check it out. And then Tim's paper came out, and again, I like. I hate to say it, Tim, but it seemed like a kind of punchline, like, oh, Foucault's approach to distance running. Like, come on, you've got to be kidding me. But I read the paper, and I realized that what Tim had done is what, certainly for someone like me, and because I'm good at explaining science maybe, but this is a whole different vocabulary, a whole different set of knowledge and assumptions that I wasn't familiar with. So I didn't understand it, but Tim had taken this and worked with Sean, applied it, he's just given us really specific and practical examples of what he meant. And I was finally able to sort of get my head around it. And so that, and then it clicked, and I thought, oh, this is actually really important. And it was still a reach to be able to pitch this to my editor outside to say, hey, can I write an article about this? And they were like, I'm not sure. And I said, it'll be kind of like a joke article. We'll make fun of it really gently. But as I wrote it, it's like, no, there's nothing to make fun of here. This is, I mean, okay, the concept is still makes me smile, but this is really, really at the heart of what I think a lot of us who think about distance running performance or endurance performance struggle with. And so what I would say is, I really liked the slide Tim put up of the analogy as an athlete is a machine. And that's fundamentally, that was the analogy that I was struggling with that led me to write the book Endure, is that this problem of the input is you could put in the same inputs and you don't always get the same outputs. It's not a perfect machine. I do the same training, and sometimes I run 342 and sometimes I run 356, and sometimes it's 1 week apart, and I don't understand why I'm good some weeks and I suck other weeks. And that led me down one pathway, which is what I ended up exploring in Endure, which is, okay, we need to include the brain. We need to think about things like the central governor theory and perception of effort and things like that. And that, I think that has some interesting things to say, and therefore you should go buy the book and so on. But in some ways, it's still an athlete-centric approach. It's just expanding the machine and saying the machine isn't just your muscles, it's also your brain. But it's not taking into account the larger context, the coach-athlete relationship, the environment, the social context in which these performances happen. And we all know that this larger environmental context does affect performance. And so what Tim and his colleagues have done is given us a way of talking about these things. And for those of you, if you look back at the workouts that Tim put up, I mean, I'd say at least 50% of them I've done sometime in the last 25 years. It's not like it's not like we're going to run on our hands now instead of our legs because we've had it all wrong this whole time. It's still running, and it's things that coaches have experimented with for a long time. But it made me think of a lot of my own coaching experiences, or my own athlete experiences rather, with different coaches who've tried these things and how I struggled with them sometimes. Like I can remember a workout in first year university where it was an undefined endpoint, and I basically walked off the track, or it was actually a cross-country workout, but I was like, I'm done with this. If you can't tell me how many reps we're doing, I don't want to I don't want to do 16 by 1,000. I don't want to throw my season out the window. I'm leaving and half the team left, because the coach had really good ideas, I recognize in retrospect, but wasn't able to articulate to us why we should be doing those. So I think one of the things that's really important here is that this work gives us a vocabulary to talk about things that I think a lot of coaches and athletes are intuitively grappling with. Why is it useful to sometimes do workouts where you don't know what the endpoint is or where you don't know what the time is? Not just because they're hard, because it's not the same as like, okay, we're going to do the next interval with one arm tied behind your back, or holding your breath and carrying your teammate over your back. That's hard, but it doesn't necessarily accomplish anything we're looking for. So we can use this vocabulary to say, well, we're looking at the constraints of time, or the constraints of space, or the constraints of organization or progression, and we're trying to break some of these habits. And I think that's important for coaches to help them, give them some ideas about how to help their athletes, but also to be able to articulate to athletes, maybe without mentioning Foucault, but to articulate to athletes, here's why we think this workout is important. And I think that's because I know I was like a really true blue physiological paradigm believer, as John would say. And so when coaches gave me these unorthodox workouts, I struggled with them, and I struggled to give them their full due. And so anyway, so I found it really interesting and eye-opening to read this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Sean has to say about how it actually went, trying to not impose this, but travel this road with his team.
Yeah. So Sean, you lived it. You're living it. Please enlighten us.
I'll try. So I guess, what John asked me to do was kind of tell my experience with the study itself and then what has happened since then. So for me, this study happened, Tim, I think this was eight years ago now, where we did the study. And I think it's important to recognize, whether you read the original paper of Tim's or you read Hutch's synopsis and outside, was that what you had in myself was a very young coach. I was in my first major job with a contract where I was going to be evaluated. I felt that I had to prove things to my bosses and to my team. And as such, I felt back on a lot of the familiar, coaching knowledge that I had. And as all three of these individuals have pointed out, that's very physiologically based. And I had success as a coach before then. So I was very, the word combative is maybe not good, but Tim and I butted heads a lot on some of the ideas he had, simply because to me they felt untested. They weren't battle ready. We had never seen anything like this. And a lot of the stuff he was saying, I just, in retrospect, it forced me to remove my ego from the equation. And that was really hard to do as a young coach. In the 7 or 8 years since, both as a result of the study, but more so from the conversations that came out of that study, and then obviously being on campus while Tim finished his degree and working. My office was 2 doors down from Jim Dennison 4 doors down from Tim, the conversations that we've had sort of, not to be cliche, but I went through a bit of an awakening period where at that point in my career, I noticed a lot of trends in some, let's say, athlete groupings. And one of those was being at a big university, we were getting a lot of 5th year eligibility transfer athletes. So these are athletes that have spent 4 years at another university. They're coming for a graduate program. They have 1 year left. And if you understand anything about varsity coaching, eligibility means the world. So it's basically you've got 1 year to take this person to as good a level, or in their mind, you need it to be better. And I really was struggling with how to get athletes to break out of their old mold thinking. And so that's where, you know, conversations, a lot of coffees with Tim, as I came back on my experiences with the study itself, meant that we were now using language that came out of the social science field, and we were really talking about how to increase engagement with athletes, how to increase their own ownership without involving more of my ego, having more purposeful conversations around both how I was teaching and how I was going about coaching, you know, my philosophy of coaching, how I was setting up sessions. And really, for me, that all boiled down to something that I heard when I was a very, very, very young coach, and that was you needed to always be asking, what are you trying to accomplish? And when I was able to remove my ego from the scenario and I was able to take the 30,000-foot view, if you look at what most coaches do in an endurance programming perspective, it looks nothing like what's going on in a race. And so between having these athletes that came in with really high expectations and seeing a lot of failures, I sort of had an awakening moment where I said, I don't think we're going about this the right way. I don't think that the answer is in to run 6 by 1,000 faster or with less rest, or to throw a girl in a guy's group or any of that. It had in challenging the underpinning idea that the answer lies in, well, you just need to get fitter. Because people were, from what I could see, were always fit, but there always came a point, whether it was in a really hard session maybe, or it was in a race, where they were breaking down as they used to, and I was not getting them any better. And so I had to start asking the question of what are we trying to accomplish, and answering it from a much different lens or much different perspective. And so for me, that's just, you know, it's hard to even have a conversation now because it's so embedded in everything that I do. And when I talk to other coaches about it, it's kind of, you know, to them, it's so counterintuitive. You know, I'll literally show up to the track and I will say, here's what we're trying to accomplish today. So just like a teacher, we'll have 2 or 3 goals, and I'll say, tell me how you think you're going to accomplish it. I'm not going to give you a workout. If you've been with me long enough, you should know what that's going to look like. And now I'm comfortable with that because it's embedded in our teaching philosophy at a daily training level, but also in my coaching philosophy. I'm okay if later on that blows up, because then we can start talking about, you know, did you really get out of some of those sessions what you were supposed to? Or, you know, was your head not in it? Or were you, you know, did you just do what you thought you were supposed to do because that's what I wanted you to do? Or did you, you know, so a lot of these conversations are very different than just how fast did you run 8 times 400? Because as you've all pointed out, to me, that doesn't really, it doesn't start to answer the question as to perhaps why things aren't going well. So that's sort of my story of what I learned both within, but more so from my experience coming out of that study and the 8 years since.
That's great. I can see that you've hurt Alex in some deep way. I saw his head just kind of with
No,
that
not
whole
hurt.
like
Just
show up to practice and like
I
do
got
what you want.
right here. It's all good.
okay. Yeah, all's forgiven. No, again, it's like the theory is amazing, and I'm amazed by the idea of showing up and saying, so what are we trying to, here's what we're trying to accomplish, how are we going to do it? It's just, I'd love to hear more, you know, I don't want to hijack the panel, but I'd love to hear more about what are the answers? How does, if you have 28 or 20 people at workout, how do you end up with people doing something?
So that's, I mean, it's one example, but to me, if you think about what you're asking an athlete to do on competition day, you're asking them to be able to prepare from the moment they get up to whatever time the race is. You're trusting that they're going to have slept well the night before, they're going to eat well, they're going to some degree get their head in the game. Hopefully they're not staring at their phone. They're going to do all these things. Then they're going to go through some bit of automation where they're warming up and that feels comfortable and they're doing all this. But then the gun goes and it's chaos. Or frankly, before the gun goes, I've seen a lot of athletes where there's a delay on the track. Maybe it's only 10 minutes. And it completely derails their performance because now it didn't go according to how they thought it should. And so for me, I look at it as, well, my job is to prepare the athlete for that. So how am I doing that? If I am not preparing them to think on their own and try to come up with solutions as to what we are trying to accomplish, then how can I ever expect them to be able to do that? So not everybody, I coach 40-some people. It's not like every day I'll come and I'll say, how do you guys want to do this? Because that literally would be chaos. It would be, let's say, it would be a smaller group. And so maybe, the best example I can give you is this past indoor season, I had a group of kids that I knew were going to qualify for the U Sports National Championships. And when I looked at from the programming perspective, so like Tim said, it's not like we can't ignore the fact that we only had 12 days rest from Canada West until Nationals if you're a 600-meter runner. We know that they need to do work in that period, but I don't know how they're going to be feeling after a bus ride. Several of them had midterm exams. Several of them, we were hosting national championships, so they were going to be stressed. So I looked forward to the idea that they were going to have input to tell me what could we accomplish so that we would be primed and ready to go for the 600-meter heat, but understanding we didn't need to put a lot of work in there. And you can't just have that conversation between those two competitions. You need to start that in September and October. So a couple times a month, I would say, we're going to load you up for 2 weeks. We don't know how you're going to be feeling coming out of that. So let's start talking about what do you think you need to do today to recover from the last 2 weeks and knowing what we're going to do in the next 2 weeks. What do we need to do? And I mean, at that time of the year, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can do way less than maybe you think, and it's not a big deal. You'll make up for it. But they get to learn about themselves. They get to learn about what it is to take ownership. They get to learn about what they can handle and what they can't. They get to learn about, gauging, just reading some of the signals. And for me, the biggest thing is we get to start having this interaction where you're being treated like an equal part of this relationship instead of me just dictating this is what's best for you, because how do I know? I don't know how you're feeling today. And I mean, frankly, I can barely get some of these 18, 19-year-olds to talk to me about how they feel. Never mind that being accurate enough information that I can make some genius decision about. So in some ways it makes coaching easier, because if you have that group, I don't have to do a ton of planning that day. I'll make notes on what they decided, but I'll just say, here are the goals. Tell me what that means for you and tell me how you're going to go accomplish that.
Okay, so that is really great insight, I think. I think so. We had some questions from the audience and some questions prepared, and I think some of the questions we kind of, you kind of knocked them off. Well, I wanted to start with sort of where you were at there, a little bit more of a just mechanical, like how to put this into practice. So some of the questions were like, where do you start with this? Is this an always thing or a sometimes thing? What time of season? So it sounds like what you've described is that if you're going to do it, you can't just drop it on the athletes like at the most important moment. You really need to make it a part of the training kind of from the get-go. So maybe, I don't know, give us some examples of how you start in September, October to let these athletes know that they're going to be treated differently and it's not going to be what they're used to.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that, and when Tim's second paper from the study comes out, people will be able to read from the athlete's perspective. We learned quite a bit in getting their feedback that if you as a coach are not bought into this and you are not espousing that you believe in your way forward, it's not going to matter. And so by that, I mean, on one of the days, Tim said, I don't want you, like, we're not going to time the reps. So nobody's going to know. Athletes aren't going to have a watch. But I still had a watch and I was timing them because I wanted to know how fast were they running. I thought it was important. And a couple of the athletes picked up that, well, the coach still had a watch. So if he says to us that time doesn't matter, and yet he still picks up his watch, what is that really telling them? You know, so I think you need to be more prepared in some of the planning, but less prepared in terms of you just have an idea of what you want to accomplish. So a very simple session that I would start with in the fall is, I would say, let's say we're going to run some threshold loops. And so the first thing you do is you give them a range of work today. You have your goals listed as to what you're trying to accomplish. And then for me, because I have such a large group of athletes, I'll just say, here's the range. So if you're a rookie, you're probably going to do low end of the range. And if you're a guy who's been here for 6 years and you're running 100 miles a week, you're probably going to do the high end of the range. But you get to decide. And so maybe you say, we're going to run 4 to 6 times 10 minutes tempo. Within those 10-minute chunks, there needs to be 3 or 4 random 30 to 40 second pickups. Okay. And so, you just make some groups and you just give everybody a number. And then you say, so if there's 8 people, it means that every other tempo rep, those 4 individuals get to decide when does the surge happen? How fast is it? How long is it? I mean, you can go back to back, so you don't have to give the rest of the group any rest. And I mean, at the start of the season, it's more, you just talk about more, what we're trying to get out of it is that people can recognize it and respond, or people can recognize that somebody's body language has changed and they're making a move. How am I going to respond to this? Because I don't know how fast they're going to go. And so if you have a 30-minute 10K guy and a 34-minute 10K guy, what's going to happen in that group is very, very different. And I think, so then I'm not having to script a lot of stuff. I just say, you can go wherever you want. You can take as much recovery between those surges as you want, and away you go. And so now I'm not having to do anything except watch. So that's, to me, that would be how to disrupt some space and some time. Am I right, Tim? I would be disrupting both of those. Then, and you just let them do that. And then for me, the other benefit then is you're never repeating a session, because no 2 sessions will ever be the same. And so from an evaluative process, athletes are more in tune to what it is that they're doing on the day and how they feel today versus, well, how did I, am I getting better from 2 weeks ago, or am I better than so-and-so?
Yeah. So, okay, Alex can respond to that.
Let me just jump in and say, I think all that stuff is awesome. I guess I would just maybe push back a little bit against the idea that what John started out with, the idea that you have to go into the deep end and you have to, it's all or nothing. Either it's a revolution or not. And maybe I'm putting words in John's mouth, so I take that back. But I think you can experiment for a coach who's interested in this but hasn't had Tim tutoring them from over coffee for 8 years. You can there are single workouts that you can do and you can just spend an extra 5 minutes before the workout explaining what's going to happen in the workout and why it's going to be different, and you can try that out and see how it works for you without throwing out the rest of what you're used to. Because as Sean said, he went through a growth process, and it's reasonable to expect that other people who are going to try these ideas won't necessarily want to throw at everything they know. And I can, to Sean's point about athletes who a delayed start of a race throwing people off. I mean, probably the first workout like this that I can remember hearing about was back in high school. I had a friend with the Ottawa Lions who said Ray Elwork, his coach then, once or twice a season, they'd be about to start their interval workout, and he'd say, okay, everyone go sit down. And they'd have to go sit on a bench for 10 minutes. And then he'd say, okay, get up, first interval. And it was just to make the point that you can sit down for 10 minutes and then you can still run hard. Like, don't panic if this happens in a race. I thought that was great. And it doesn't require a knowledge of the social theory underpinnings to have that workout be really useful for everyone involved.
Yeah. So I think that kind of connects nicely to the next question that we had, which was, how long will it take to sort of see results? And I want to kind of maybe offer my own potential answer to that, which is it depends. And you could see something right away, like that Ray Elric workout is a lesson that you can understand very concretely right away. But if the example Sean gave before about being better prepared for for a 600 after having 12 days where you're trying to manage the workload. So how do you know if you're successful in this endeavor?
This is the challenge for Tim.
Yes, there you go. Well, first I want to say, so of course there's a continuum of these changes, and you can disrupt in a small way and you can disrupt a little bit more. And some athletes, and as Sean said, just getting it's in review right now. There's a paper about the athlete's experience. Of course, everyone's probably wondering, well, what do the athletes think of all this? Like they're the ones that are sort of the end product. So it's mixed for sure. Some athletes had some amazing experiences from some very small changes, throwing out the watch, changing the space that they do workouts in. It's amazing to hear they have a different sort of view of their bodies, and they maybe were able to run the best workout they ever have because of that. Although sometimes if you have no watch, maybe you don't know specifically, but that can be a good thing. So, and the biggest thing this changes, and Sean kind of alluded to this, as far as your coaching goes, even with small changes, is you don't want to just make the change and sit back and then do nothing. So when changing the practice, your instruction changes. I think your pedagogy and instruction kind of is elevated, even though maybe that practice prescription, you don't have as much of a practice prescription. So maybe you don't have that 8 times 400, you're disrupting it a little bit, but the instruction and the learning pedagogy that can come out of that is really important. So those are those kind of learning moments to grasp when, as Alex had talked about, if you're not given your watch, if you're not given the exact number of intervals you're doing, it's really difficult. Well, boom, there's a learning moment. Why is that difficult? And chase that and then go down that road a little bit with athletes. Some will just really struggle, and then it's not worth it. So I also want to stress that these sort of changes aren't for all athletes. Like, this is not like a blanket thing. Hey, let's put them all in this and let them all go down this road and see what happens. And it should be kind of sprinkled in. I think it should be used just in little bits, especially at first, until athletes are sort of used to this different way of training. And it doesn't have to be a complete overhaul of everything you've done. Of course, these physiologically based workouts, interval workouts, have been successful for a reason. But it's just for some of those athletes that might be struggling, hey, here's a potential new way of practicing that might open up new understanding for those athletes. So.
And that requires you to think individually about athletes, which I think is something that, not in a malicious way, but I think it can be challenging for a coach who's got 20 to 40 athletes in a group to really be able to drill down and say, what, you need this and you need this, when the structure is like, well, we're here on Monday and it's time to do tempo, so that's kind of what you're going to do. So there are a couple more philosophical research related questions that I wanted to throw out there for Tim. One of them was, and maybe this is a question that's going to be answered by that athlete paper, but the question was, how does gender factor into your Foucauldian reading of distance training? Do the technologies of discipline you outline influence different groups of people differently depending on their gender?
Yeah, I didn't really go down the road too much of looking at the differences in gender. So I was just, as far as the athlete paper goes, we're looking at athletes' experience as a whole, so it didn't really matter. It did, although in general, it did seem that some of so without looking at gender, I mean, athletes who are less kind of enamored by numbers by maybe the technology. Technology is a really important part, because when you look at time and space now with GPS, people are very into, and then you upload your data to Strava. People are very into data, and very much there's this idea of quantification of the self. We like to see data. We like to know our biometrics, and so we didn't really look down the road of data, but it was more those who were more interested in data and knowing their progression.
Okay.
Those are the ones who struggled a little bit more with some of the changes. But again, like I said, those are the opportunities to have those learning moments and those teaching moments, coaching moments, really, to say, okay, well, why is that? Let's maybe bring this in a little bit slower then. So, yeah.
Did you notice gender differences, Sean?
On some of the sessions, like Tim talked about, we have a lot of engineers in our group. And so when we tried sessions where we weren't telling athletes what the workout was, we would just go rep by rep. Some of the females as a collective enjoyed that more because it allowed them to be in the moment. But some of the real data-driven guys or linear type thinkers didn't. They just struggled with that a little bit more. So we had to figure out different ways to tackle it for them. But that's probably, yeah.
Like Alex.
So yeah, let me jump in here and say I'm one of those guys, and so I really struggled. Like I had a coach, Matt Centrowitz Senior, who would, if he caught you checking your watch too much, he'd make you tear your watch off and throw it off. I super struggled with that, but in a sense, that was almost, I think that was a sign that I needed it more. So maybe a coach needed to be more patient with me and explain it to me better, but I needed it more. And then the other thing was to just relating it to Sean's point of if you're undercutting that message by secretly timing it. Well, then eventually I got injured when I was training with Centro. And so I was just hanging out with him, watching the other runners. And, he was always insistent, I'll do the timing. You guys don't worry about it. Don't look at your watch. Then I'm hanging out with Centro. The runners leave. He forgets to start. They come through 400 meters later. He's just making up a time. He's like, 62. And I'm like, what? You mean I've been doing these workouts all this time and you've just been, so then I knew he was sincere about it, the time doesn't matter, but it blew my mind. And it was hard for me as a data-driven guy to accept that.
Wasn't that how you had your big breakthrough too in Sherbrooke? I think the key lesson here is just lie to Alex about everything and that'll help. It'll help him break through.
Yeah, delusion is the secret.
Yeah, I will add that as a bonus sort of learning point was that throwing away my own watch and focusing on the athletes while they were running really honed my ability to understand movement and flow and just learn the athletes. I can tell just by foot strike whether someone is on or off that day. And so, I lie to them all the time as well, because sometimes they just need a number. But that lie to me is embedded in my ability to watch just how are they moving that day. And so in a lot of ways, this forces you to be a much better coach in terms of certain aspects. So you're not just reliant on what this thing says all the time, as evaluating yourself as a coach based on how fast your athletes run.
Okay, so we're close to 2 minutes to go here. There are a couple more I wanted to get at. I wanted to ask this other research-related question because I think it's interesting both from the research theory point of view and also from Sean's point of view. So the question is, has your research linked self-determination theory, relatedness, competence, autonomy in a coach's lens in order to help them understand these technologies of discipline at all? Further, can you expand on power relations, gaze, and panopticism an athlete may feel from those outside the coaching team? So that's kind of where I wanted to go practically. Sports, sports scientists, nutrition, sports psychologists, Sean's assistant coaches. So I'm not even sure I know what that question means, but I think Tim's nodding, so I'll let him get into it.
Yeah, there's a few parts to that. So self-determination theory, of course, is more looking at the athlete and giving the athlete more autonomy and more choice. There are 3 different parts that I can't remember those 3 different parts right now, but it's how the athletes make
autonomy. Is that the thing?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely. That's more coming from the psychological literature. This is more of that sociocultural realm. So if we're kind of zooming out and looking down a little bit, so that's by extension, we are changing a little bit and giving athletes more autonomy. So through making these changes, these structural changes to practice, so we're allowing athletes to have more autonomy and make more decisions. So it is linked that way to self-determination theory. Now, Panopticon, of course, that's another very popular, very important Panopticon and surveillance concept used by Foucault. It's that kind of, I didn't talk about it, I didn't go into it here, but that's that wider gaze. Sean did talk about that. When you're making these changes as a coach, you're being constantly surveilled too by broader society and other coaches and even athletes who are judging you. So this panoptic relationship where you're being watched and controlled in a way and constantly monitored without always knowing can be definitely something that gets in the way to making any sort of change, which is why coaches, and Sean kind of talked about this, will revert back to those standard kind of go-to practices, and you don't want to make any changes because of that sort of that gaze. So yeah, it's linked into that. That's definitely something important. And through the papers, I go more into that, the Panopticon surveillance, and especially with the paper about the athlete's experience coming up. So.
Sean, did you have anything on that in terms of just like the other professionals around you and how they were responding to you?
Yeah, they think I'm great. Because at times, like, you're just, Tim kind of described it as time, space, movement, and I'll use all that, but I usually have a fourth one, and it's just called chaos. And so there's times where I'm not that creative of a guy, so I try to look at what is the sport requiring and how can we coach people to be adaptable, because it really is chaotic. And so there are just, even in my own training environment, there's people looking at what we do and they don't get it, and that's okay. But it doesn't change what we do. So yeah.
Okay, cool. So I want to do one last question, which maybe isn't that hard. Just we were talking about your group, university athletes. Do you think that this is a good approach or a better approach for one age group or another? Like, would this work in a high school setting? Would that be maybe a better place to start people on it? Or like, how do you view that? Because you do have a particular demographic that you're working with. What do you think? Could it work with high school or different age groups?
I guess yeah, as Tim said, I think you've got to look at your scenario and potentially sprinkle some of it in rather than just this all abrupt change. But from the coaching perspective of looking at what athletes bring to the door on a varsity level, and I mean, John, you would understand this, that a lot of times it's very hard to work with kids now coming into a university environment because they're so set in their ways. And so I remember doing a comp dev course or performance coach course, and I told a group of coaches that when I get an athlete that comes in the door and he immediately knows all of his splits for all of his race times, my immediate alarm bells start going off that this individual athlete's going to be very hard to work with, because he's already got it laid out as to what it takes to be competitive or successful. And I'll say, you haven't even seen the level of competition you need to face. Guys are going to eat you alive, or girls are going to eat you alive. And so I look at it as you need to be adaptable in order to be successful, as I guess I define success at this level. Why would we just start teaching those people at 18? And so for me, I mean, it's even earlier than high school. You can start to teach people some of this stuff. Just to be spontaneous is something that we don't see much anymore. And that's nothing, that guys our age would even contemplate as a coaching tool, but you're having to embed that now into training philosophy because people just don't see it. And being spontaneous in a race is, I mean, if you think about what happens in the last 20%, somebody's going to go, you've got to be able to react to that. So my overall answer is yes, it just may look a little different.
If I can add to that, so I think some of these changes with someone, I mean, endurance training is hard, right? No matter what the sport is, it's monotonous, and it can be very difficult to stay with. We see a lot of dropout. So what if some of these practices, a little less structured, were kind of, like Sean said, sprinkled in near the beginning? I think a lot of these practices allow people to explore their bodies, and also there's a bit of a play component, and that's being a little bit spontaneous. But if we can get some more play and some more choices that athletes make into practices, maybe they wouldn't be as sometimes like very strict and monotonous. So I think it can bring a different element into training, and especially for someone just starting out, and maybe it's high school, the first time you come to a practice, so I think it can be used. It really depends on the athlete, but it can be used at all different levels. And then you get the high performance athletes too, where it can be just as important to break down some of those barriers.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, just maybe kind of a final word to go back to something traditional that people would be familiar with. In high school, we used to do fartlek, like real fartlek. Like they would go run 5 miles and fartlek it. And now even I kind of admit to this, like when I say fartlek, what I really kind of mean is like timed intervals, because I'll tell them what the fartlek is. But that's not what fartlek is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, get out there when you're feeling good, put the foot down and then chill for a bit, and yeah. And I mean, I did do that that way once, but I don't know. So anyway, thank you. This was really great. In the last of our sessions, I think I admit this is a bit of a like a special project. I wanted to kind of put it in for me because I think it's really interesting. So I'm glad that we could get 75, 80 people to listen to our conversation about it. For the questions that didn't get answered, we'll try to see if we can't get the guys to maybe answer a little bit for us and send it out by email or something like that. But this is a conversation that can go on and on, so we'll cut it here. But thank you very much, everybody. And if you if you haven't seen all the other webinars, they're on the website athleticscanada.ca/coaching/elearning. This one will be there too. You can rewatch. And we will be back. We'll have another one in July, and then hopefully monthly we'll be back again in the fall. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right, great.
Thanks, guys. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, John, for hosting this